Hello, Art 109 students, calling here to give our video lecture for our next artist. I am going to begin by reminding you that you should have watched the Hearts of Our People video, which was 6 minutes long, and our Native Art Now video, which was 30 minutes long, before watching this video. So if you haven't done that yet, please pause this video and go back to those two videos posted on Blackboard. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and move on. Okay, so I know our focus this week is on Wendy Red Star, but I want to begin with some really important context to what we're going to be talking about with her as a visual artist. And that is this idea of how we look at Native or Indigenous art or objects, or do we call it Native American, or do we call it Indigenous art? It's so confusing. And that is because language is super important here. Again, remember, the goal of our class is to be critical and to think about the way that different artists are perceived throughout history and time. We're trying to get out of, again, that Eurocentric perspective of looking at art, because Native people are not from Europe, right? So is it necessary that we look at their art through the lens that we typically look at European art? And when we even call the objects that Native people created art, we're taking something away from those objects, because many of those objects were not created as art to be exhibited in some sort of museum. So when we talk about Native Americans or we talk about Native people, we can get a little bit tied up with how we refer to their work. There's not necessarily a wrong or right way. I just crossed out those words to kind of show the gray area that we have in terms of talking about these things, just to point out that we should think about them critically. So do we call them Native people? Do we call people American? Are they American because, they were living in America before we even called it America? Are people who are Indigenous, are they creating art, or would we rather call them objects? So this context is extremely important to how we look at work of Native people. Okay, so let's look a little bit more into how this can be seen or perceived as more controversial. And we talked about this and already learned about this in the Native Art Now video that you've watched. So here we have some images of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and this is the exhibition called Art of Native America, which was part of a larger collection of artifacts. And these objects came from a variety of different Indigenous cultures, so it wasn't just one particular culture, and they were definitely exhibited in a very Eurocentric way, again, with sort of white background. They were put in these really crisp and beautiful vitrines, but we're not really seeing the works within their context. These were wearable works. They were worn on bodies. They were parts of different ceremonies, different ways of seeing the objects in this way. And many groups denounce this perception of Native objects. They do not want them to be exhibited in this way. This is very much controversial. And we heard again about this through our two videos that we watched. But I just wanted to sort of point that out, that this is very culturally complicated, and we need to be sensitive to that complication. So a little bit more context. In the Native Art Now documentary that we watched, they brought up two different movements that really were sort of a huge turning point for Native art, or Native objects, if you want to call it that. And that is the American Indian Arts and Craft Act of 1990 and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. And these are both laws that are, part of American legislation that is making it, number one, illegal to create works or objects or art that is a misrepresentation of different Native American art and craft products. So this means that so-and-so who is a European American from, let's say, a random state like Ohio, who has no Native ancestry, cannot go and produce artifacts or objects that are meant to be represented as native and make a profit off of it. That is illegal. So any sort of artifact or object or art that comes from a Native American has to be authentic in that way, has to be connected through ancestry in order to make a profit off that object. Another big thing was this idea of returning Native cultural objects. So this could be all of these different museums throughout the country have human remains, sacred objects, funerary objects, and different objects of cultural sort of significance that were taken. They were stolen through colonization from American Indian tribes. And this idea is that they need to come back to them. So whether that be directly through ancestry, or it might be at some sort of institution that represents different Native tribes, they have to give them back, or they have to get special permission to have them. So these are two really big turning points in the terms of talking about the history of Native and Indigenous objects. So we looked at our first video was a brief overview of the Hearts of Our People video. And then we also looked at another short video that kind of reviewed what the exhibition was about. So I just want to kind of summarize a little bit of what was talked about in this exhibition that was it was done at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. So this is just a portion of the exhibition statement where they talked about, they brought together 50 communities and cultures from all over North America. And this exhibition was not meant to be a comprehensive overview of Native women's art. Okay, so this is important. They're saying here, listen, there is no way that we can create a comprehensive overview of the art of women that are Native in one exhibition. That would be impossible. And that is what we are acknowledging in this class altogether, right? We can't look at it in terms of this more Western perspective of looking at like the chronological time period and looking at art, but rather they really wanted to focus on juxtapositioning historic objects with contemporary artists' work and how those contemporary artists' work were inspired by that lineage and by that history. So we looked at a few different artists in this video, The Hearts of Our People, the second little short video that we watched, that talked about how there are so many ancestral items being showed alongside the contemporary. So again, that's key. And the idea that you can look at the contemporary art next to the historical piece, and you can make those visual connections, right? You can make those cultural connections. That's a very rich way of looking at the work. We see this other quote here, we still use these symbols. And so you see this ongoing renewal and connection through the imagery that you're seeing while walking through the exhibition. I also really liked this quote from the video by Danny White Hawk that said, meant to operate as a shift in power. Power has been held by European men and European American men. A nod to the acknowledgement of those female artists is meant to shift that power. So we talked previously about patriarchy and this idea of male domination in these different fields. And what she's saying here is that we need to acknowledge that there's a shift in power now. And then we also watched Native Art Now, which was the first 30 minutes of this documentary. We even saw our artists as a part of this documentary that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But I just wanted to highlight a few takeaways from this video. So there was this perspective that many Indigenous artists have struggled for recognition and acceptance in the mainstream. So that's pretty obvious. Like we already know that just like women artists, Indigenous artists certainly have always been sort of lumped into this category of, okay, they are Indigenous artists, they are Native American artists. They are seen just in that category when not all Indigenous artists are the same, right? They come from different ancestral backgrounds. They come from different regions of the country. They certainly have different voices and perspectives. And we need to get away from this sort of idea of putting them all into one category, which has very much been the Eurocentric way of looking at Native art. Okay, we saw some common themes: identity, sense of place, community, power, this idea of having power for yourself and sticking up for yourself. We see a lot of questioning of tradition as like, okay, we tend to look at Indigenous artists through this sort of guise of how we look at Native Americans in general. And we have our stereotypes, and I'm going to talk about stereotypes in just a moment. We have our stereotypes of how we look at these people. And the reality is this tradition, right? This idea of their culture typically can lead to stereotype. And if we just focus on the history and the tradition, we're going to miss so much rich culture because cultures evolve and grow. So to be able to look at the contemporary artists next to the historical artists in that Hearts of Our People exhibition is a good example of how we can look at tradition, we can respect it, but we can also acknowledge that we really need to focus on what's happening in the present. A lot of the artists in the Native Art Now documentary push against generalizations. They do not want that more homogenistic perspective on looking at Native Americans. And we're going to look at some examples of that when we look at Wendy Red Star's work. And then creating work that addresses one-sided historical events. So I know growing up when I was in elementary school and I was learning about Native culture, I very much had a one-sided education in terms of I really saw Native people from a Eurocentric view and really hardly ever learned about what it was like for a Native person throughout history. So I think that it's important to acknowledge that these artists are trying to, when they're talking about history, they're trying to address the fact that their perspective was rarely shown in the history books, and they want it at the forefront now of the discussion, which is exactly what Wendy Red Star is doing. So let's look at her work. So some milestones, some sort of background on Wendy Red Star. She was born in 1981. She is from the Crow Reservation, which is from Montana, and she currently lives in Portland, Oregon. She has a very traditional art background. So she holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts from Montana State University and an MFA, Master of Fine Arts from the University of California. She had her daughter, Beatrice, who is there on the left-hand side at the age of 26. And as we will watch in the video, her and Beatrice work a lot together on art. And she has gallery representation from Sargent's Daughters in New York City, which is a big deal to have gallery representation, particularly as a Native artist. Because we have to remember, just like in the videos we watched, we saw that Native artists are usually lumped together in this sort of all-encompassing exhibition. Like, right, we'll put all Native artists in one exhibition, we'll call them Native artists. But the reality is every single artist in that group has their own identity, their own perspective. And the fact that Wendy Red Star has her work represented by a major art gallery that shows all different types of artists from different backgrounds, different races, different regions is a big deal. So some more background. As she was growing up, she was very much immersed in the culture of her tribe, the Crow culture. And her father was a creative person. He was a rock musician. Her uncle was a painter. And then her grandmother was a sewer of regalia and beadwork that was traditional to the Crow culture. So when she reflects on her childhood, even though she may have grown up within sort of the perspective of what we would perceive as middle class, she feels that she very much grew up rich because she was surrounded by these creative people in her life. And she was very much influenced by her grandmother, which is the image of her here, Amy Bright Wings Red Star, and talks about how she was creating these traditional regalia outfits and has these memories of her always working on them, always sewing the beadwork in her craft room, and how, you know, for some reason, she sort of didn't necessarily see her as an artist, but rather saw her as, this is just what Indigenous people do. She thought, you know, this is her lifestyle. So there very often we see this idea that many people from Indigenous cultures don't perceive what they do as artists. They don't necessarily see that, okay, because she creates this regalia, these traditional Crow outfits, she is very much an artist. She is very much, you know, showing her talents, her aesthetic, creative talents. So, you know, what Wendy Red Star is saying is that being exposed to this creativity certainly had this major influence on how she perceived the world in this creative manner. So she sees herself very much as a feminist. And I think, you know, the feminist art movement that I mentioned in our introductory video from the 60s and 70s was very much a movement of that time that continues till today. Okay. So we can say the feminist art movement is still happening. Okay. So I love this quote from her where she's talking about that as an indigenous person through colonization, which we've talked about previously in this class, they are having to deal with same dilemmas that women are experiencing all over the world. So just because she's a Native person does not mean that her experience is any different than a lot of other women throughout the world from different cultures and regions and backgrounds. So she's saying that, anytime she experiences something that makes her feel historically and culturally specific to her Crow background, she uses this hashtag, which I love. I think, she has this really great Instagram account if you want to look it up. And she sees Native artists as being recognized in exhibitions and feels a change. So she's using this hashtag as this sort of empowerment and saying, look, here we are. We have been historically marginalized. So she's not saying just her Crow background, her Native background. She's also saying women in general. And here we are making a difference, changing things for the better. So growing up, Wendy Red Star always really struggled with being in this sort of traditional art setting. So she went to an art school where she was often the only Native person amongst her fellow students and her instructors. And because of that, she was always perceived as this idea of other. Otherness came up a lot. And she was often discouraged not to create identity-based artwork, but rather talk about larger issues outside of herself, which she counteracted and fought against. She said, just because you don't understand where I came from, just because you can't understand what it's like to be a Native woman, does not mean that I should not make art about my identity, my background, and my history. And as a result, she's created this beautiful, amazing, and very strong body of work. But that was not without lots of pushback from the people that were around her. And she explains this by saying, she noticed her professors weren't able to really talk about her work, and they were uncomfortable positioning themselves in a place that they didn't have knowledge. And this is something that represses lots of women artists, because those who are in different colleges, different professors, traditionally in art schools, are men, and typically can't relate to their students and discourage them from talking about feminism or women's work or women's perspective in their work as a result. But that certainly has changed a lot over the last 20 years. Wendy Red Star goes on to saying, I used to hear expressions like identity-based artwork is dead, and she felt a sense of guilt about it. But as we know, looking at her work now, she started to overcome that. So she wants to really talk about this idea of how Native culture in our country is often romanticized and idealized as this sort of homogenous culture, that all Native people dress the same. They all believe the same belief systems. They all have the same rituals. They all are part of the same sort of homogenous tribe, when that is not true. So although Wendy Red Star has the perspective of Crow, she also wants to just play with this idea of the romanticism of Native people. And she wants to criticize it through play. And she often uses play and humor as this sort of tool to talk about this idea of romanticism. And she reflects on this time where she was at a natural history museum, and she was looking at the dioramas, and a lot of the dioramas sort of reflected and showed Native people in this very romantic, homogenous way. And she is sort of poking fun of that by putting herself in these dioramas that she creates herself to talk about this romanticism. So she's actually upping the romanticism through this 4 seasons project that she did. And we'll look at a few other examples in just a moment, where she's then bringing in these sort of ridiculous things like inflatable animals, plastic flowers, astroturf, other artificial materials that references this history of the diorama, and is kind of criticizing this idea of, why are we romanticizing Native culture? Instead, why aren't we really focusing on the individualized beauty of different tribes and different perspectives in different regions of the country? So she did a series of those prints, and we're going to look at more of those in just a moment. But before we do, I want to also point out this connection to human and irony that I just brought up. So she typically uses humor and irony as this tool. So during the same time as the 4 Seasons project, she created this project called The Last Thanks. And it's this extension of this idea of how the mainstream perceives Native people. So she talks about the tradition of Thanksgiving, which in elementary school, we're all taught that the Pilgrims came together with the American Indians and they kind of came together in harmony. When in reality, we know that that is not actually what happened. There is a very complex history that we could spend a whole semester learning. But it is very much unfortunate that we still are teaching it in this way in our schools. Even, I've reflected that my 6-year-old, when she was in first grade last year, is still learning it in this way. And Wendy Red Star is proposing this different interpretation. She's poking fun at America by bringing in processed foods, because America is very much all about our processed foods. And she is talking about this idea that Native populations do not have to access the same quality of food as the mainstream group. So there's this irony that if we were to look at reservations in the United States now, we would look that the obesity levels are extremely high amongst Native populations, diabetes, different sort of factors that are around having a very poor diet is connected to these different people who are living in these reservations. And that is often due to being poor, to being marginalized, and not sort of this sort of generational repression. And so she's poking fun at lots of different things, but she's poking fun through humor to reach us, right? She also is bringing in these like ridiculous headdresses that the skeletons are wearing, because often if we do look at appropriating Native culture, we'll see like young children might appropriate by wearing a headdress, and she is sort of culturally criticizing that. Her dinner companions are skeletons that are gesturing toward this idea that actually, if we really go back to the history, Native people, there was a genocide happening against them, right? They were being murdered by the hundreds. We've even heard this most recently in the news in Canada, where we learned about these mass graves that were found of Native children as a part of boarding schools. So this is certainly no laughing matter in terms of there are so many people who were killed as a result of their Native sort of ancestral background. And she is definitely using humor, but she's using it with irony. And she also brings in a few other sort of symbolic artifacts. So she brings in the American Spirit cigarettes, which are sort of seen as this sort of connection to tobacco, which is traditionally a sacred plant for many nations. But yet, despite the repressive national laws, has become a revenue stream on many reservations. And therefore, so they're making money, but they're not necessarily always making money through healthy outlets, right? Like cigarettes. This also can be a stereotype that we see that many reservations have casinos, for example, on them. And then Red Star continues to force her viewer to grapple with all of these terrible ironies, challenging conventional stereotypes, but doing so with that humor and that irony, but also just saying, how are we perceiving Native people within our mainstream culture, and how are we perceiving them throughout history? And we're still celebrating Thanksgiving today, so something to think about. So stereotypes are key in Wendy Red Star's work. She is breaking down stereotypes through this idea of humor and sort of the jokes that she is making. So this piece called 1880 Crow Peace Delegation, which is a sort of series where she would take different photographs of different people from different Native cultures. In this case, this is the medicine crow, or also referred to as the raven. And these are images that are taken from US government archives. So she takes the original photographs. This one in particular connects to her Crow culture, her Crow delegation, and she sort of takes time to analyze them. So she goes in and she writes on them, she annotates them, she points things out through her sort of intervention of writing. And in this particular photograph, this was happening around this sort of large scale meeting that was negotiating the expansion of a railroad that was happening through a Crow reservation. And shortly after this photograph was taken, it was very much stereotyped and commercialized. So just like we talked about with that act where white people cannot, European Americans cannot sell Native artifacts any longer, this was before then. This was when this photo became this sort of more romanticized version of this Crow man, and was sold and mass produced as this like portrait, this sort of beautiful portrait that someone could purchase. So this photo has a lot of sort of baggage to it. And she's wanting to talk about that. She's wanting to point out the ironies of these things. So the language that she has written out on there is pointing out these different stereotypes that we see of Native people. And in this particular, this Crow man, and wants to have us second guess, why is this happening? Why are we commercializing? Why are we romanticizing Native people? So their notes, again, are kind of pointing out the different costume elements, trying to educate the non-Indigenous viewer on how white Americans are often very ignorant to this culture. And she includes information about this particular chief with these anecdotes, talking about personal details that relate to his history as well. So one other theme I want to sort of refer to that you've heard me mention is this idea of a homogenous way of looking at Native cultures. So we know this idea that Native cultures exist. We know that they typically live on reservations, right? And typically the reservations of today are not in the same region or geographic location as the original culture's reservation may have been. And like, for example, the Crow Reservation may no longer be where it originally came from. So Wendy Red Star wants to confront this homogenous view of Native people. So she did this whole series of colorful photographs that consists of these images that were taken on different Crow reservations throughout the nation. And she photographed sort of reoccurring things that she saw, right? So she saw these sweat lodges, she saw signs, churches, broken down cars, houses that were sort of dilapidated or falling apart. And she wanted to point out the fact that we homogenize these things. This is our stereotype of what a reservation looks like. When in reality, yes, there are reoccurring themes, right? Like the signs or the sweat lodges. But the reality is that they are not one homogeneous culture. All different Crow people are different people, particularly if we're looking at through a perspective of contemporary Crow, where people have different jobs, they have different life experiences, right? They even have different religions or ways of looking at belief systems. So through making them homogenous, she is sort of in this ironic way bringing up the fact that we do this as American culture tends to do this. We tend to lump everything into one category. And she's referencing these two German photographers who have done this sort of same idea, but they typically do it with industrial buildings and this idea of like families of objects. So, but in her way, she's really trying to focus on this idea of the homogeneous. And then I wanted to show you just a few close-up pictures so you could see it better. And there's definitely a reference here to how different Native tribes and Native cultures are confronting this colonization of religion, this idea that different religions come in and try to transform belief systems. So here we even see, you know, Baptist churches, we see Christian, Lutheran, Catholic churches that are showing up on these reservations. So definitely an artifact of colonization. And then on the right-hand side, I just wanted you to see how big these photographs are. They're pretty large scale when you walk into the gallery. So the last series that I want to show you from Wendy Red Star is this idea of Indigenous futurism. So she did a series of these digitally rendered photographs called Thunder Up Above in 2011. And these works imagine the presence of these fantastic astrological landscapes. And in this series, she started creating these very fashion-oriented, futuristic powwow outfits. And again, we have to remember that she's not going to just show historical, authentic Crow outfits here. She is imagining a future for Indigenous people. She is bringing in different layers of cultural influence, colonization even, into the works. She is wanting to refer to the fashion industry. She is not just a Native artist, right? She is very much her own person who is influenced by different things outside of her Native culture. And that is really important to point out here. So I can see this series as being a really great example of that. Okay, so she's really into this sort of 70s fashion as a part of this. And she's sort of poking fun at the fact that Native people were often seen by European explorers and colonizers as these sort of strange aliens, right? So when Europeans first came to the country, they saw these Native people and they were seeing them as these sort of other, these aliens, people they've never seen before, people that they don't understand. And of course, in that case, they feared them, right? Therefore, it led to their genocide. But they definitely, you can definitely talk about the fact that us as a society still does not entirely understand Native culture due to that one-sided history that we talked about before. So in this series, she's sort of imagining this other frontier, this sort of future of how we can perceive Native people throughout our sort of contemporary perspective. And this also refers to immigration and illegal aliens, which also can be a reference to how we are still dealing with those issues in our country. So just a few images of that to show you. And these are herself dressed up in these different costumes. We can see references to Native dress, but also references to fashion of the 70s and 80s. And then this sort of cosmic irony to it as well. Okay, so at the end of this, this is our last slide. I want you to watch this video that is posted on our Blackboard page, and then you'll be done for watching your videos and you'll be ready to take your quiz. Bye-bye.